The year is 2021, September 1st, and the remnants of Hurricane Ida are moving through New York City. The deluge is so quick and so intense that streets turn to rivers in minutes. The downpour is so strong that it breaks through the walls of basement apartments, ultimately drowning 11 people, including a mother and her son in Queens, the borough that I'm from. At the time, my brother was living in a basement apartment in Sunset Park, Brooklyn's Chinatown. These poor folks, it was the middle of the night, so maybe they were sleeping, maybe they were just resting. And the idea that they were so suddenly faced with this like wall of water, it's just so terrifying to me. And it's stories like these that really fuel the work that I do around the Polluters Pay campaign.
Hi, welcome to What the Earth, featuring smart and personal conversations with experts working to solve today's biggest environmental challenges. I'm Mel Argeson, and I'm here with Kimberly Ung, Senior Attorney at NRDC in Environmental Health, and we're talking about Polluters Pay. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Polluters Pay laws are gaining traction across the US. What exactly are those?
Polluters Pay is really based on a very simple premise, which is that if you make a mess, you should clean it up. And this applies as much to my 1-year-old daughter as it does to the world's largest fossil fuel companies. And this is actually not a new idea. For decades now, we've been really relying on this principle to enact a number of environmental laws. And the work that we're doing under Polluters Pay, the Climate Superfund laws and these climate right of action bills, they try to get at the same principle using a different mechanism. And what we're trying to do essentially is with the Climate Superfund bills, we're trying to pass bills at the state level that require the largest oil and gas companies to pay into a fund that the state could then use for expenses associated with climate adaptation.
You know, Polluters Pay is really fascinating because exactly as you said, whenever we were a kid and we were told, if you break it, you buy it, that's just always stuck with us. I mean, if I'm walking around a museum like the Met, for example, I'm walking around with my hands tucked in, I'm clutching my purse because I know if I topple that vase from 500 BC, I'm paying for that and I'm going bankrupt. So how come this concept isn't being applied to the fossil fuel industry, as you've said, is responsible for most of the damage? And also because these climate disasters like Hurricane Ida are only becoming more intense and more frequent, and people are losing everything they have, from their houses to their neighbors to their own lives.
Yeah, great point, Mel. Has climate change ever affected you in a personal way?
Yeah, when you were talking about Hurricane Ida, I don't remember that one specifically, but I do remember Hurricane Sandy. I was in high school at the time, and it was around Halloween, and Halloween was canceled. And so people were still in their Halloween costumes walking around, but you knew that something was wrong. The lights were out, my basement was flooded, and my English teacher came into school the next day with this undershirt underneath his usual button up. And he said, I lost my house and I lost all my things, and this is all that I have. And I just remember that being one of the defining memories from that year in high school. And I think that's my connection to Sandy and to the climate crisis, and knowing that people in my community, people I knew directly, were affected.
Hurricane Sandy was transformative to me too. At the time, I was working for the city of New York, and our offices had lost power during Hurricane Sandy. And so we weren't able to work. So instead, they encouraged us to help out our communities in whatever way. And I ended up volunteering for a length of time for an impromptu homeless shelter that was just a few blocks from where I lived. Essentially what the city had done is taken over a local high school and used it to shelter folks whose homes had been flooded by Sandy. And I think before that moment, I cared about the environment, but I don't think I had really zeroed in on climate change as the biggest problem facing our generation. And it became so clear to me then, especially as I walked into that shelter and I realized that nearly everybody in that shelter was a person of color. And I think prior to that experience, I had thought that climate change, for as terrible as it was, I mean, people talked about it like it was the great equalizer, something that hit everybody equally. And it became so clear to me in that moment that it was like every other environmental problem that we have in this country, which is that it really does fall hardest on folks with low incomes and people of color. And I think that experience really did change the way I look at not just climate change, but environmental problems generally.
I think this is a reason why I find Polluters Pay so fascinating, because it's already happening in New York, in Vermont, and 13 other states. And what happens when all the states have a Polluters Pay law?
I mean, there are a host of life-saving projects that states could be implementing today that would save hundreds of thousands of lives every year. And they're simply not doing it because they don't have the money in their budget to do that. Something like the Climate Superfund Act would really solve that problem. So it saves money, it saves lives, and also it creates jobs, because who's going to be installing that air conditioner? Who's going to be implementing natural wetland habitats in areas, in near metropolitan areas that happen to be coastal? Who's going to be installing flood walls along important cities that are very vulnerable to sea level rise? It's going to be working folks, right? Folks who need jobs and will be paid to do these jobs by the oil and gas industry.
So we're talking about the Climate Superfund bill, and this collects money from large fossil fuel companies. Who manages that fund, and where does that money go? Do you have examples? Do people get it? Do insurance companies get it? Help us envision, where is this money going to go?
So under the Climate Superfund bills, the fossil fuel industry, large oil and gas companies, would have to pay into what's known as a climate superfund that could then be used by the state to pay for life-saving climate adaptation measures. These fossil fuel companies would be charged proportionate to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions they've had historically. And the state would be responsible for dispersing those funds associated with the Climate Superfund. And this could go to a wide variety of projects. They could happen at the very small scale, like, for example, paying for an air conditioner for homes who would otherwise not be able to pay for air conditioners. They could pay for life-saving healthcare measures that would protect people who are vulnerable, and it wouldn't be felt on the backs of a lot of Americans who are already drowning in debt, often associated with healthcare costs. But that's on the small end. On like large infrastructure ends, I mean, this could help repave our highways, rebuild bridges, fortify tunnels. So it really does span the entire scale, from like small, very specific household interventions to large, very ambitious infrastructure projects. And again, these all create many, many jobs for the state. The other type of bill we're trying to work on is known as a climate right of action bill. And this bill would allow ordinary people like you and me to sue the fossil fuel industry for damages that we've personally incurred as a consequence of climate change. So for example, if you live in LA and your home was destroyed as a consequence of wildfire, you could sue the fossil fuel industry to help rebuild your house. And this is a wonderful transformation in thinking about who is responsible for these climate disasters. Because right now, without these laws, we're paying from one way or another, whether it's through state taxes or directly through repairing our homes or paying for air conditioning. We're paying for the costs of climate change. But the fossil fuel industry is responsible for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so shouldn't they be paying for part of this tremendous cost?
Yeah, everything you're saying sounds like people would get on board with this. What is it that people who hear about Polluters Pay, what can they do to make sure that these laws are passed in more states other than New York and Vermont, and that maybe could eventually get to the federal level?
So there are currently bills in 13 states that would fall under the rubric of polluters pay. And I would encourage anybody interested in this issue to reach out to us.
You heard it here.
And ask, is there a climate superfund bill? Is there another type of polluters pay bill that is being introduced in my state that I can support? And we can plug you in to the folks who are working on that bill. And then once you discover if there's a bill that's already been introduced, we can introduce you to the folks on the ground who are supporting that bill, and you can get involved with them. And the needs are going to vary by state. If there is no climate superfund bill or any kind of polluters pay bill that has yet to be introduced in your state, I mean, I would encourage you, if you really feel like you have the desire and the time to do it, find a way to introduce one in your state. The wonderful thing about NRDC that we're doing that I'm very excited about is we are defending existing climate superfund laws in both New York and Vermont, the two places where these laws have already been passed. And we are able to take that expertise that's being used and created through litigation, and we're using that to help draft climate superfund laws on the ground. And so it's this kind of beautiful iterative model. Often we turn to litigation, and the litigation team is like a last resort when things don't work out. Here we're doing something very different. We're flipping that on its head and involving the litigators at the very early stages of climate superfund legislation to craft bills that are most likely to succeed in court and that are most responsive to the needs of the communities.
And that sounds like something that would be scary to the fossil fuel industry, knowing that the climate crisis has affected everyone in some way, shape, or form. That, you know, if you have a health problem or if your house doesn't have AC during the extreme heat, you may have a case to be able to sue the fossil fuel industry. And I think that really puts the power back in the hands of people. And that's something that I think a lot of us can get behind.
I mean, to me, in a lot of ways, this is a no-brainer. And I think that feeling is felt across the country. In a recent poll, 75% of Americans approved of a law that would hold the oil and gas industry accountable for damages associated with climate change. That's a tremendous amount. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of support across the country. And it's not just like left or right. I mean, it's true, 86% of Democrats do support bills like this, but also 61% of Republicans. I mean, that says that the majority of people, regardless of political affiliation, support polluters pay laws.
Is that like a death sentence to the fossil fuel industry? Would it end them? Or is this just something that would kind of just put them in their place?
This isn't game over for the fossil fuel industry. This really is a game changer, however. For so long, we've been in an extremely unequal footing with the fossil fuel industry, who, as I've explained earlier, is out-resourced us by more than tenfold, probably 100-fold. And what this does is it allows communities to harness some of that power and use it to protect themselves and to save the lives of thousands, probably millions of people across this country. And I think that by doing that, we really are changing our relationship with the fossil fuel industry. They've been lying to our faces for 50 years. And to come to a reckoning where they're not only forced to acknowledge that climate change is happening, but that they are responsible for it is huge for me.
Would you say that generally people know that the fossil fuel industry is bad?
There's been a lot of polling on this. And I think most people have mixed feelings about the oil and gas industry. I think a huge part of the reason why they still have the social license that they do is because folks have bought the propaganda that they've been selling, which is that climate change isn't real, and that even if it is real, they're not responsible for it. We're responsible for it by driving our cars, by turning on a light bulb, when actually the oil and gas industry has created a system and is spending ungodly amounts of money to maintain this artificial system that is premised on the purchase and use of a product that they sell that is poisoning us.
I wonder, though, if we can look historically at other industries that have been destructive to our health, like maybe the tobacco industry, and how that industry has changed over the years. I know people were able to smoke indoors. I don't remember those times, but I know that was a time. But something happened within the public perception of tobacco and cigarettes that now we're not allowed to smoke indoors. Can we think about industries like the tobacco industry and compare it to the fossil fuel industry, or see what strategies were used to help change the narrative of how these industries sell to us and damage our health?
100%. I think the fossil fuel industry is very analogous to the tobacco industry, in that for a long time, the tobacco industry was also highly aware of the very terrible effects of smoking cigarettes. And they spent a lot of money and a lot of time convincing folks that that causality didn't exist. In fact, the causal relationship between burning fossil fuels and climate change is much, much greater than the causal relationship between smoking cigarettes and getting lung cancer. Just the science there is also extraordinarily strong. This is stronger. And to the extent that we can take, pages from the tobacco playbook and use them for the fossil fuel industry, that's something we're thinking about all the time. And there's so many ways in which this industry affects our health. It's not just directly through climate change. Methane that comes out of our stove also emits a whole bunch of other terrible toxic pollutants that get into our lungs and make us sick. And so another bill that is not a part of our Polluters Pay campaign, but it is very much a part of NRDC's campaign, would place warning labels on gas stoves, for example, to warn consumers when they purchase a stove that that stove, when used as it's directed, can make you sick. And that's just another example of ways where we're trying to think in new directions about how to fight this tremendous industry.
And it sounds like money is not an issue for the fossil fuel industry. Is it the fact that once these laws get passed, it shows that states have power and they have power against them? And is that what scares them?
That's a really good question. Why are they scared? Are they scared? I'll answer the question that I just asked for myself, which is that they are scared. And you can see that in just what they're doing. So a few months after, this Climate Superfund law, they've been passed in 2 states so far, in New York and in Vermont. And a few months after the bill's passages, the fossil fuel industry met with the Trump administration. The number one thing they talked about at that meeting were these Climate Superfund bills.
It's $1 billion industry.
Trillions. They make trillions of dollars a year versus, and they make trillions of dollars a year, and they are subsidized by the federal government, $35 billion a year. That's just an incredible amount. And that doesn't even account for the subsidies they get from the state and from local governments. I think what makes them scared is not just the money, although, of course, it's the job of a corporation to maximize profits. But I think it's also the narrative connection that these bills demonstrate, which is that the fossil fuel industry is the primary driver of climate change. What I think is so important about these campaigns, like the Polluters Pay campaigns, is this understanding, this ability to hand tools to the ordinary citizen to say, no, there is something you can do about it. You can pass these laws at the state level. You can warn people about the health effects of oil and gas. You can force them to pay for life-saving measures that will protect you from climate change. This isn't ride this horse till it dies. This is like, get on that horse and change directions. There's a lot we can do here. And I think part of it is just letting people know the menu of tools that are available to them.
I love that it is a very this is something that we can do, because for so long, I think we listen to the propaganda from the fossil fuel industry and we think, oh yeah, it's not fixable at this point, but we know that's not true. And so what gives you hope about these polluters pay laws? Where do you see it going from here?
Yeah. So the campaign that gives me the most hope right now is the one that we're working on in Illinois. What's really exciting about the work we're doing in Illinois is that NRDC is getting to start at the ground level and, like I said earlier, draft a bill from its bare bones, informed by the expertise that our lawyers have developed in New York and in Vermont. And what I love about this is we're not just including the litigators who are defending these laws, we're also including environmental justice communities who live in Illinois. In fact, this is an EJ-led coalition to make sure that those who are hurt first and worst are able to incorporate parts of what they care about into this bill. So if there are things that they're experiencing firsthand, whether it's flooded basements or extreme heat without any relief, they can take those concerns and build them into the bill so that they can be protected when this bill passes. The other thing we're trying to do is really incorporate labor into this conversation as we're drafting to make sure that we're getting that perspective of like, well, what job creating opportunities are there here? What types of projects that are associated with climate adaptation can also help the average working person make a living? And so, it's about climate adaptation, but it's also about justice, it's about fairness, and it's about really improving people's lives day to day. And I think that ability to bring in these expertise, these multiple forms of expertise from different stakeholders is something that is going to make this bill unstoppable and a model for other states going forward.
Thank you for saying that. I feel like during these times under Trump 2.0, I'm just looking for a win, and polluters pay definitely sounds like something people can get behind, and it feels like we can actually win this.
I really hope so. Thanks for having me, Mel.
Thank you.